The sun is crossing the celestial equator and entering Aries, and that happened about 1.5 hours ago by Greenwich Mean Time. And what that means is that it's officially, therefore, the first day of spring today. So it's a day for new ventures, for new hopes, for uplifting the spirit, for beginning things. It's almost like a second day in the year for New Year resolutions, if you want to make those like spring resolutions or something like that. So therefore it's a brilliant day to be doing this. And I have brought a birth chart, which is what my book's about, which is about birth charts. This is a birth chart for the spring equinox. So it's not for a person. You do charts not just for individual people, but also for events, and this is an event. So it's set for London at 5 o'clock this evening, today. Okay, and we have some quite nice configurations. It has a big blue triangle, which in astrology is called a grand trine. Now I'm not going to get into it, not necessarily unless anybody has any questions later, but I just wanted to mention that as a sort of starting point for talking about the book. Okay. So, I am going to assume, although there are one or two people that I know, but I'm going to assume not a great deal of knowledge about astrology. I'm going to explain a little bit about what I'm doing. But before I even start about that, I need to talk about a way in which you can approach the subject of astrology. In chapter 2 of the book, I devote a small section of that chapter to what I call magical thinking, because that is a way of thinking that looks at life through correspondences and associations and doesn't lend itself readily to the modern paradigm of, shall we say, cause and effect thinking. There is a popular view, I suppose, amongst many people in Western countries, that if something cannot be rationally explained, logically proved, or proved to have a cause which results in an effect, it is therefore not particularly meaningful, right? If you approach astrology in that way, you are not going to get very far, and you're probably going to end up thinking that astrology is just rubbish. So one of the things I want to communicate really is that you need to, if you're going to really get into astrology or related subjects, you need to turn your thinking round to actually see things in a different kind of way, to perhaps think in terms of correspondences or associations, because astrology embodies, it's a symbolic language as much as it has a mathematical astronomical basis to it, which it does have as well, right? Astrology consists of what I will call archetypes, right? Now, I can use that in the strict Jungian definition of, or I can just look at the word in general, and it means really, as far as I understand it, that there's a base meaning to each symbol, each thing, and that has a manifestation in many, many, many different kinds of ways, right? To give you an example, if I take the planet Venus, for example, now most people would associate Venus, if they think about it at all, with love, right? Okay, that's fairly easy, right? But how can one explain in a rational scientific manner how the planet Venus not only means love or ways in which one relates, but also it has to do with your personal values, it has to do with the metal copper, it has to do with your sense of beauty, whether that's of a rose or of your lover. It also has to do with your financial situation. All of those things do not apparently seem to be particularly related to each other. But because this symbology behind astrology spreads its meaning far and wide, and if you start to think in that kind of way, then if you had it explained to you, you might actually see how those apparently unrelated things actually come together. Yeah, okay. In my view, astrology is not a science. There have been astrologers down the years that have wanted to make it into a science, and it certainly has a sort of a scientific basis. As I said, it has a mathematical and an astronomical basis. You know, the planets are real up there, right? So, in my opinion, it's not a science because of its symbolic content. It's also not a religion, and it's not a belief system either. In fact, I think it's very difficult to classify astrology. It's unique. There isn't any particular system of thinking that is like astrology. It's a very different system. Now, I've been practicing astrology. Well, I qualified more than 20 years ago as a professional astrologer, and I was studying before that, and I'm still studying. It's an endless subject. You can study it forever. Right? There are branches of astrology that I'll never look at because I just don't have a long enough lifetime to be able to do it. But the subject of my book is natal astrology, which is to do with individual birth charts. It's looking at each of us individually, because everybody has a birth chart, whether you believe it or don't believe it. You have a birth chart, which has, in astrological thinking, it has a profound meaning. Your birth chart describes the person that you are and the person that you can become. So as a baby grows from being very tiny into childhood, adolescence, and adulthood, middle age and old age, so we don't remain the same person. We change, of course we do, right? But essentially the archetypes remain the same. So wherever our Venus happens to be placed in the chart, some of the things that I mentioned earlier are going to be there but evolving. So your birth chart evolves as you do, right, to different levels of its manifestation from the same birth chart, right? The birth chart comes from your date, place and time of birth, right? Time is particularly important in astrology. And one of the main reasons I actually wrote this book, right, and who I wrote it for, is for just people. There's a lot of astrology books out there that are really written within the world of astrology, for astrologers, for people practicing astrology, for students of astrology. This book was not intended for that. It was intended for people out there that have an interest in the subject. My idea was to have the book in not only specialist bookshops like this one, but also to have it in more general bookshops, such as one might find in cities in this country and many other countries, because I felt that there may be, who knows how many people out there somewhere who are interested in learning this subject but don't really know how to go about learning it. So I wrote the book with that in mind. Its subtitle is A Step-by-Step Guide to Learning Astrology, and that's what I did. I went through it. I've gone through how you do this in stages. I hope it's readable. I've had a bit of feedback from people who say that it is pretty reasonable. I hope so. So that people can follow it. But it's also not talking to dummies, so I'm assuming that everybody's got, a level of intelligence. So I tried to appeal to that intelligence when I was writing the book, right? I just need to get some water. So that was why I wrote the book. That was my intention, was to get it out there. It's really, I feel really honoured that there's 3 astrology schools in Britain that I know of that have put the book on a recommended reading list. So it's like, wow, I didn't write it for astrologers, and but it seems to me that some people think it's useful for beginning students. So that's really nice for me, and I'm really pleased about that. What's in the book? Well, I decided also at the beginning that I was not going to get into technicalities. Either an astrological software program if they have a computer, if they have that on the computer, or there are websites where you can actually go and get a birth chart done if that's what you want to do. And in the book I've put a link on my own website so that you can actually put in your birth data and actually get a chart out, so you can get that from just having the book, really. So I avoided that. I also did not include hardly any astronomy. I just included enough astronomy so that people can see why the time is important and why the date is important. It's to do with, with the Earth going round the Sun, and it's to do with the spin of the Earth. If you want to know more, read that little section in the book. And otherwise, I did include some history as well, because astrology has been around for like a really long time, 5,000 or 6,000 years at least, since the time of the ancient Babylonians. So I found its history myself kind of interesting. So I synopsized it. When I first wrote the history, it was like ages long, because that's a lot of years to put into a small chapter. But I brought it down, just tried to pick out the really main areas, and hopefully that's not amazingly boring for people. I hope it's of interest, because it gives it its context. Where did it all come from? How has it evolved over the centuries? But it's skippable. You don't have to read that. The whole of the rest of the book is what it means, what it's about, how you do it, right? I started after all those things at the beginning. I started with defining the planets through from the Sun, because we know, astrologers know that the Sun's not a planet. We know this, but for convenience we call the Sun a planet. We look at the Sun from here, it took us until, I don't know, the 1700s to figure out that we weren't the centre of the universe, and that the Sun is actually the centre of our solar system and not us, right? But astrologers still look at the Sun and in fact the Moon as if they were planets, because that's what they look like from here, right? So we use them, and actually the meaning of the Sun and the Moon in astrology is really, really important. It's a real basis to your personality. That includes the so-called rising sign or ascendant, the angles, and also the aspects. That's the connection between the planets, right? They're the 4 basic building blocks of astrology. And I've devoted a chapter to each of those bits, right? So I go through those in some detail with some examples for people, right? And I also suggest, just before I start writing all that, I also suggest that people get their own charts in the ways that I've described, because then they can follow the book using their own birth charts, right? So instead of giving lots and lots of famous examples, which a lot of astrology books do, I say, hey, look at you, look at your own chart. I give a little picture of how you draw the shorthand symbols for astrology, for the planets and signs and so on. So you can look at those on your birth chart and you can identify them, and then you can read and gradually build up your knowledge of what that's about. Yeah. After I've gone through the 4 basic building blocks in the book, I then talk about other things that you can add in. So I've talked about chart imbalances, because charts have all different shapes. You may notice with this one, if you look at just the shape of the chart, never mind what it all means, right? You notice that there's a lot of planets. These are the planets around here. There's a lot over that side. There's not so many over there, right? That has a meaning too. The positions of the planets around the birth chart, it has a meaning, regardless of which planets and which signs. It's just the shaping, and then you can get from the image, from the image of the chart itself, you can also start to get a meaning, right? So I've written in the book about chart imbalances. I've written about some of the smaller aspects, or the minor aspects, so-called. Something kind of pretty strange called the Moon's Node, which I'm not going to get into right now. So I've talked about the things that you add into the 4 basic building blocks in order to start to put it together. So towards the end of the book, I talk about ways in which you can actually put this information together to actually look at your birth chart. And there's a study chart in the book as well, which we also go through. And then you can end up making a synthesis, actually putting the birth chart together in terms of its meaning, so that you can use it. Astrology needs to be used, right? Okay. Do you want to ask me some questions? I'm not sure. The question was, it was about magical thinking, and it was talking about the planet Mercury, and if there are any particular placements for the planet Mercury that might be more, what should we say, skeptical. Yes, that was the word I was thinking of. more sceptical about astrology than other placements, right? Okay. Well, the planet Mercury represents your mind and your thinking. Now, I started talking about ways in which people think, right? The person that asked the question asked about Mercury in the sign of Taurus because the planets are in signs. That's how it works. Possibly Mercury. I need to say something about rulerships. Planets rule signs. Yeah, in astrological thinking. So Mercury is particularly strong if it falls in the sign of Gemini because it rules Gemini, right? It also rules another sign. It rules Virgo, right? So if you've got Mercury in Virgo or Gemini, you certainly would be open, I imagine, to the idea of astrology. You know, you would be willing to explore the idea. You know, you may not immediately kind of take on board, actually believing in it, shall we say, or thinking it's valid, but you think about it. If you have Mercury, for example, as the person that asked the question asked, in the sign of Taurus, Taurus is a sign that is very grounded, very practical, probably prefers to have things proved rather than vague. Mercury in Taurus may actually not easily embrace the concepts of astrology. It's not to say that people with Mercury in Taurus don't use astrology, but it's less easy, I think, for people with Mercury in Taurus. If you have Mercury in Sagittarius, you're probably very open to the idea as well. Oh, there's lots of different placements. Does that sort of answer your question? I mean, basically what I'm saying is yes, I think some placements of Mercury might indicate less interest or less openness to something as symbolic as astrology.
From my experience, from aspects, people who have Mercury connected with Uranus are more likely to be interested in astrology.
You're obviously a person that knows something about astrology already. So the question is, aspects, that is relationships between Mercury and other planets. I don't know whether that's going to be a question that the audience would actually like me to answer. Do you want me to answer that question? Okay, no problem, I can answer it. Okay, so aspects are the relationships between the different planets on the birth chart. And if a person had Mercury connected by some form of aspect, for example, to Neptune, you're probably going to find them in Watkins' bookshop, because that's the kind of openness to the other worlds, or something, shall we say, the word of imagination, the word of inner thinking, maybe a spiritual approach to life or something of that sort. If a person had Mercury in connection with the planet Saturn, right, that would give the kind of mind where there would be a lot of questioning. There would be an inclination towards wanting things to be really shown to be valid. Saturn needs things to be in some form of structure, needs to have clear answers, doesn't like vague things, whereas Mercury Neptune would be much more open to the spiritual world. Mercury Saturn would not necessarily not be interested in astrology, but would actually be inclined to question a great deal, I imagine, for example. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That's a really good question. It's a question about the birth time and how important the birth time is, and if you don't know your birth time, or you don't know your birth time accurately, does that mean you can't have a birth chart done? And the answer is absolutely, you can definitely have a birth chart done without a time, right? Usually different astrologers will do different things. Some astrologers will take sunrise as an arbitrary time for doing the birth chart for a person. I tend to take midday because sunrise varies from day to day, and I find that quite a difficult thing to do. So I would take midday. I'd take midday, noon, 12 o'clock. What you lose with not having a time, or with having an inaccurate time, is your rising sign, right? I can illustrate that better with this picture again here. Right, now, So this birth chart that I keep using of the spring equinox, it's got a time. It was 5 o'clock this evening here in London where the sun went into Aries, and that it's to do with the spin of the Earth, right? As the Earth spins on its own axis in 24 hours, so each of the 12 zodiac signs are said to rise above the horizon of the place where the birth chart is set, or the place of birth, shall we say. Yes? Okay. And that results in a particular zodiac sign is rising above the horizon of the place of birth, right, at the time of birth, right? So this one, it says As, short for ascendant, or rising sign, which is the same word for ascendant and rising sign are the same thing, right? And it says that this is the sign of Virgo, and at 5 o'clock this evening, the sign of Virgo was rising above the horizon of London, right? It's not anymore. It's probably Libra by now, right? The next sign. It's the Earth spun on. Roughly, on average, it does vary. On average, signs rise about every 2 hours. So in 24 hours, all the signs rise as the Earth spins, right? As seen from Earth, that is. If you don't have a time, what you don't have is an ascendant. You can't have an ascendant because you don't know the time, because it's dependent on the time, right? It's also, there's another section of astrology called houses, which all are calculated from the ascendant, so you don't have houses either, right? However, there's huge amounts, no, don't look so worried. But there's huge amounts of information in the positions of the planets and the signs and the aspects between the planets. Without them, the time is irrelevant to that. The only one that is affected is the moon, because the moon moves quite a lot. Moves nearly half a sign in 24 hours. It moves fast, right? But there is an awful lot of other information. So yes, you can have a birth chart without the time. It's nice to have a time, but if you don't have a time, you can still get quite a lot of relevant information from the chart without a time. Yeah? Okay. Okay. So the question is about a technique in astrology called chart rectification, and whether it's worth pursuing that. Sure. It's a bit of a specialist area, and not everybody practices it as an astrologer. Chart rectification is a system where you list significant events in your past, right? Your marriage, birth of your children, moving countries, whatever, right? Doesn't have to be physical things either. It could be a big change of heart that you went through, for example, right? And you make a list, and you list the years, and as far as you can remember, the months, if you can remember, even approximately. And then there is a technique which is called rectification, where the astrologer will look back at those events and will look at what was happening for that person astrologically, and try to work backwards, seeing what was going on for that person at that time in terms of moving planets. So yes, I think rectification is reasonably quite effective. It takes a bit of time, but there are certainly plenty of astrologers that do it. So yes, there you are. Thank you for reminding me. Yeah, rectification is a possibility for people with no birth time, or with an inaccurate birth time. Yeah. Okay. Your question is, could you get a better chart from using rectification than your actual chart? Well, you'll never know, will you, if you don't know your time of birth? You don't know whether it's better or not. Now, I'm going to give you an example from my experience, actually. This wasn't done by rectification. This is my own chart, right? I didn't know my time of birth, right, at all. And I couldn't find out, I thought. So years ago, this is when I first started doing astrology, somebody dowsed my birth time with a pendulum, right? Through the whole 24 hours, right? And came up with a time of birth of, I think it was about 12:30 after midday. And I was very keen. I just started doing it. I hadn't calculated the chart. Wow, I've actually got a rising sign, right? And it gave me a rising sign of Virgo, right? And I lived with that for quite a long time. I started to study astrology. I lived with having a Virgo rising. I got to know what it was. I looked at all the planets in the houses. You know, it's like, oh, okay, is that me? There were a couple of things that didn't seem quite right, but okay. And then, lo and behold, quite some years later, a little baby book came to light from my mother, which I'd never seen before. and it had a time that was almost 12 hours different. So that changed my rising sign to Pisces. So I had this other life, right? Was that better? Maybe. I'm very happy to have Pisces rising. I have got Pisces rising because it was written, the time of birth was written in the book, right? I was actually born just after 5 o'clock, well, just at 1:05 in the morning, and not 12:30 in the middle of the day, right? So I had to adapt myself to a different birth time. So I don't know. Maybe that was better, maybe it wasn't. But I lived with this chart that wasn't true for a long time. It had some relevance because Virgo's on the other side, it's from the descendant, so it had some relevance anyway, but actually it was actually reversed. So maybe that answers the question. I don't know. As in my own example, you know, there's a polar opposite, because each sign is opposite each other side. It has an opposite, right? So Gemini's opposite Sagittarius and Pisces is opposite Virgo, because it's a circle. And you've got 12 signs, and so they're opposite each other. There are 2 signs opposite, each of the signs have another half. And it's like, is there a polar opposite? Yes, there is. And I believe that every sign has what I might call its shadow side, something like that. So let's move away from my own example and find another one. Let me think. So let's take Aries, Libra, for example. They're opposite signs. Aries is the first sign, so the sun's in Aries today, right? It'll go into Libra in September, right? So whether that's the rising sign or the planet in the sign, it doesn't really make any difference, just the signs themselves. So Aries is a sign which is tends to be quite spontaneous, enthusiastic. It's a fiery sign, impetuous, likes to kind of get on with things, quite impatient, lots of buzzy energy if you've got Aries in your chart, right? And it's said, one of its more shadowy sides, shall we say, is said to be somewhat, I'm being very careful because there might be some Aries in the audience here. It's said to have a sort of a slightly self-centered side at times, because Aries just, Aries just gets on and does it, and doesn't always stop and think about the other person. Its opposite sign is terribly aware of the other person. Another person, Libra, is a very kind of me and you, and I will look after your needs and I will be aware of what you think and so on. But Aries just goes for it, bang, right? So each side has a sort of shadow of the other side, if you like. You know, so I mean, within a Libra there may be a secretly selfish side, and within Aries there's a kind of, actually, I do really want to relate to other people and I don't want to be disapproved of, which is something that belongs to Libra. So there is a swing across from yes, so the answer is yes. There is a connection in the polar opposite, but it's more shadowy. I suppose it's not so obvious. Astrology is a very subtle art, you know. Lots of subtle stuff in it. Okay, you're welcome. That's quite a difficult question, actually. I mean, yeah, so the question is, were certain signs more prone to have things like, or disabilities, perhaps, if you want to call it that. I don't even know if it would be called a disability, but Asperger's syndrome or something of that sort. I think that's quite a complicated question. I don't think I can answer that in a short way. I mean, I'm certainly not an expert on Asperger's anyway. But I think it's probably a combination of different planetary connections rather than it being a particular sign or due to a particularly, you know, a difficultly placed planet. I think it may be to do with, you know, a combination of different factors on the chart, right? What you can see, however, just talking about houses for a minute, is, for example, if people have, for example, Saturn is the planet that all astrologers love to diss, really. Saturn is to do with, you know, where we're most vulnerable, but where our greatest gifts are, abbreviating it, right? And if one has, for example, Saturn placed in the 3rd house, the house is the house of the mentality and the thinking and the schooling and that kind of houses are to do with where in the chart, or where in the person's life things happen, right? The signs are more to do with how things are manifest, right? If you had Saturn, for example, in the 3rd house, I have often seen, it's not always the case, but I have often seen people that have perhaps a small speech defect or something of that sort, or perhaps a difficult experience of schooling. That can be the case with that placement. So, but Asperger's is probably a bit too complicated to answer, but it's a good question.